Good to see you all here. And good to hear the conversations already going on tonight's important topic. I'm Claire Craig, I'm the Provost, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this Provost's annual lecture. We have students and fellows and staff of Queen's College and friends from around the university. We also have those of us in the room here in the Schulman Auditorium in the college and people online, so welcome to you all too. Every year we discuss and hear from a leading thinker on one of the big issues of the time, and they don't come much bigger than this one. In a moment I'll introduce our distinguished speaker, but I also wanted briefly to explain how the evening is going to run. So Professor Tubiana will speak for around 25 minutes, and then we have three designated respondents, a fellow, a graduate student and an undergraduate student, who I will introduce later. And there will then be a discussion between the four of them, and then the evening will be opened up to questions from the floor. I'm afraid we can only take questions from those who are in the auditorium, but I'm sure that will provide lots of diversity. So our guest speaker today is Professor Laurence Tubiana. She's Chief Executive Officer of the European Climate Foundation and a professor at the École Normale Supérieure de France, Paris. She's had many distinguished and senior roles in her career, but is known perhaps most to many of you as a key architect of the Paris Agreement in climate change. And she was France's climate change ambassador and special representative to COP21, and then UN high-level champion for climate action, and has possibly been at every COP, just about. So she's going to talk tonight not only on the past, but on the past refracted through what's happening today. And as the title says, 10 years since Paris, advancing climate action in a turbulent world. And every time it feels turbulent, you see the kind of politics that's been going on over the last few days, and it gets even more turbulent. So incredibly timely. Please join me in welcoming Laurence.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I came last year and I was so pleased to see the atmosphere, what Oxford is, and in particular this college, that I wanted to come back. So I'm very happy this has taken form in your invitation at a particular moment. We would probably not have thought that this shock and chaos within which we are living now, and to try to make sense of it, which is really difficult, and I don't pretend I will, but at least think together. It's really an important moment. And of course, this anniversary at the same time of this decision and the new government and in US and whatever they do, which is even bigger than just withdrawing from Paris Agreement. It's just at the same time 10 years after an exercise which of course brought a lot of hope, a number of lessons of how countries can at least agree together, and at the same time just look back what we have achieved or not with that particular framework, and in a way what we should do now in a context where it's so different from what we could think even 1 year ago. So again, there is a number of reasons where we can be frustrated with what is happening now on the climate action side, where you see very few governments putting climate change very high on the agenda. I think I listened to the South African president in Davos, and he was very strong on climate impacts and the way we have to react to that. But it was mostly an exception. And so this world we are, of course, on one side, Paris Agreement has been a reference since the last 10 years on the objectives, in a way, what is in there as a discipline for countries to have climate plans, to have long-term strategies, to report every 5 years and to try to do better. And so the mechanics have been working. And in a way, Now more than 107 countries have now have now made commitments to net zero emission, which I can tell you, and the people who know there, Lavanya was not far away, people didn't understood what they signed on in this 12th of December 2015 and what's translated then. These weird paragraphs that, of course, people know in climate science know that what this means, but that with this net zero by 2050, which anyway, for most developed countries is too late, but still is a mark in the sand that we should at least. So a number of countries are thinking long term, and you see that even big countries like China or big emitters, and on the other side, on the current trajectory, we are headed for 2.6 or 3.1 in the best case scenario, when we do what we have committed to do. And you look at numbers that could be promising, peaking of the emission of China probably this year. But when is a decrease? A question mark. Let's see what they decide. So a number of back and forth positive and negative results. And in my point of view, of course, a good rewarding to see that the movement of the Friday for Future, the young people, the case in the courts refer to Paris Agreement as a commitment that government has to fulfill because they sign off. So, sort of mosaic in a way of different things. So I think Paris Plus 10 is not just a symbolic moment. It could be, but it's really a real inflection point. Now we are 25 years away from 2050, so very few years left. And in particular for the moment where the emission has to drop dramatically, 2030, so this is really in 5 years' time. And of course, what was dominant in the last few years was we have to accelerate action, but at that particular moment, talking about accelerate action these days in the context we are in is very difficult, since in particular, I think the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That has flipped totally the narrative, the notion of security, the notion of priorities. So I do think still, not because I am an optimist, I am not, nor a pessimist, just we just have to continue and to be stubborn in the trying to move things, because it's a major, of course, that's a coming catastrophe. We cannot accept that it happened, even if it's happening already in many countries already. And that was, of course, what we have witnessed in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. So, but there is a useful lesson we can draw from how the Paris Agreement was reached. We can serve us today, even in this chaotic period. So, we can analyze the positive forces would help and the negative ones, and look at what they are today. Well, the positive forces were, first, starting by the negatives. The negative were evidently the embedded interest, in particular the fossil fuel sector. Clearly, even if they were relatively discreet in Paris, they were louder and vocal among the year after Paris, because they didn't believe we could get an agreement in 2015, I can tell. And then after that, of course, they realized they have to fight in a much more obvious way. And the influence of oil, gas, and coal interest, well-funded, very well-funded lobbying, of course, very good access to governments and to the anxiety of security. So, including, of course, a massive investment in disinformation, which was something new, didn't exist in Paris, really. Well, we knew the climate denialism, but it was still limited compared to what it is today. The perception of climate action as a cost. I remember always my good friend Nick Stern, trying to demonstrate that inaction has a cost, but was not listened to by economists mostly. Still, some days not, today. And that negotiations are a zero-sum game, and that climate negotiation is about distributing the burden of action, never thinking about the benefit of action. So, but there were strong positive forces. The US-China discussion as a way to tackle a global public good together, which was a new form on a bilateral discussion that was handling a problem there where they were, of course, big drivers. And of course, I cannot go in detail, but we know in particular the second term of Obama, together with Xi Jinping, was a moment where they really seriously discussed. And that was even prolonged after the first withdrawal from Paris by Trump, by the Biden administration. There was, and it for me was even more important, or as important, the High Ambition Coalition that pushed for the 1.5 target, which was considered by most of the G7 countries impossible to accept, and some, of course, oil exporting countries. But the voice of the small and the victims were very, very effective, finally, in the Paris system. The EU, as a major developed bloc, frontrunner of climate action because of this long story since Kyoto, with all the internal instruments to try to reduce emissions. And on top of that, which was, I think, a very important factor, was probably not evaluated enough in Paris at that time, the role of non-state actors, in particular the local authorities, the state, the municipalities. That, of course, will come so strongly in 2017 when Trump will decide to withdraw from Paris Agreement for the first time. So these positive voices were enough to counter the negative ones at that time. And so where are we today? So do finally the same positive and negative still apply, forces? And are there new forces that were not existing really in 2015 and are now much stronger? Well, the fossil fuel economy regrettably has won much more space than they had in 2015. Major part of the global economy, still 2/3 of the growth in global energy is from fossil fuel, the demand. Still 7 trillion, that IMF numbers, of indirect or direct subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, 7 trillion, which really, when we are looking for money for climate action, we are talking in billion, not trillion. At least we don't know where to get it. The shale revolution, the US shale revolution, where fracking for oil and gas is now, the US is now the largest oil producer in history. And of course, the links, as we see, of the oil and gas sector in US and the politics, which of course are very obvious, as we saw in the, just in the decision that Trump has taken immediately. And of course, we saw the difficulty to address in the COP, in the system of UNFCCC, the problem of the lobby, in particular the lobby of oil and gas. And we have seen since COP 20, 26, 27, 29, 28 and 29, the challenge all the time to recognize or try not to recognize the role of this sector as the transition away, which was decided in COP 28 and really harshly maintained in COP 29. The growing rivalry of US and China has increased significantly with some spillover into climate action. When John Kerry and Joe Biden and his State Secretary, John Kerry, tried to maintain this dialogue with China, even if there was a lot more anti-Chinese vision and, in a way, tension around technology, around, security issues, they both try to insulate climate action from that with some success. In particular, in 2023, we have the Sunny Land statement, which shows that they wanted to protect the global concern they have. And of course, China, as well as US, at least in this administration, knows very well the cost of climate damages today. And the Chinese know, of course, have a very clear image of what is happening for them. But now climate cooperation is more difficult, much more difficult. And in particular because the transition implies some kind of codependence on technology, of course, because of the advance of China on all the green technologies, critical material, where China is the dominant factor. So this is not helping anyway, even with different government, the climate cooperation. So now, of course, the US has decided to take another route. really focusing on the redevelopment of energy based on fossil fuel. And at the same time, which I think I just begin to understand the politics with the alliances on the technology sector with the oil and gas sector, because of this immense demand of energy that artificial intelligence needs. And that's why this sort of is much more than the cars, the oil industry is an immense demand, at least at that stage where AI is not energy efficient, that they need absolutely access to any energy resources they can get on. And that where finally I understood ex post why this supposedly modern sector of technology was so much linked to the fossil fuel sector. So the political economy here, I think I was really not understanding, because not understanding the role of this new technology in the landscape. Of course, there are still obstructionist countries like Saudi Arabia, and where China works quite often in the different settings, the G20 or the COPs. And I am curious, and of course, all the relation with Russia makes that the political economy, the global political and security economy, makes the distinction of protecting climate as a quite difficult setup, which we have benefited in Paris, evidently. So the in EU, you see that the far-right movement have been really very strong against any climate policy, which is now, and I see here even in UK, not as polarized than in US, but coming in to that idea that climate policies is an elite policy against people. And that, of course, something which works in Germany, in France, in Italy, and in UK. And that, of course, a new dimension that was not there in 2015. The EU own climate program is under attack. Just now, the formulation is no more climate policies, it's clean policy. We don't see even green is something we are withdrawing from because of the fear of being attacked by this movement. That result, of course, in a not so good result of the European elections, where finally the far right has been quite high in some countries, in particular France and Germany and Spain. The Global South positioning, breakdown in trust vis-à-vis developed countries, clearly since COVID, very evident. The COVID vaccine selfishness, the dash for gas after Ukraine has been a major factor of distrust. Broken promises on climate finance, even more. And so, very difficult for EU, even if they want to stick, I hope, of course, will defend the Green Deal and keeping the climate, the 90% that has been now committed for 2040 of emission reduction compared to 1990. Still, Europe has to reshape or redefine relation with others in a with a different tone and a different capacity. So Europe cannot meet its climate goal without a strong cooperation with China. It's impossible. And then even Europe cannot meet its climate goal without strong cooperation with a number of countries in Latin America on critical materials, on Africa and many others. So there is a codependence of the climate policy in Europe that really is related to the capacity of Europe to talk and work with others in a very different setting. On the subnationals, I think, and I think I was in Rio last autumn, and you see that the movement is stronger than ever, which is really interesting. Why finally, and it was a revolution from an international relation perspective that cities and states would say, we take back our sovereignty to decide that we are still in the Paris Agreement. Legally doesn't mean anything, at least for now. Maybe in the future we'll have a new governance. But that the movement for, we have to keep going because the climate impacts are felt really by the citizens. We are close to them and we have to respond. So they have been a safety net for the Paris Agreement, really, in 2017. I think they are still. And in a way, America is all in, which of course has been preparing for this US election, is still 63% of the US population, 75% of the GDP. So there is a capacity of response that which I think still an untapped potential, in particular on the global governance side. In the national policy making, on the national determined contribution, I see much more interest at the positive forces, where you see that a number of economic sectors were not there in 2015, but we are not now there and need the transition to continue to be competitive. And that the positive force that was not existing in 2015. Take the batteries industry, electric cars, whatever, the list is quite long now. And these people are now speaking up that they want the climate agenda to stay strong. But then, and that in a way a terrible element, the worsening of the climate damage, which is not for a longer term, it's just now and every week. And so impossible to ignore. The start analysis of the IPCC 1.5 report in 2018 is just showing up what we are running into, because of course of the overshoot we are very close to deliver. For the anecdote, the French government tried, because at that time, at that moment, they were not so keen on emission reduction. So they tried to see how we can adapt, and how we can adapt to a France at 4 degrees. And all my colleagues of the physics of climate brought the report. And of course, you imagine, we cannot adapt to the 4-degree scenario in France. So the report, you imagine, was just put on the shelf and just shut up. We don't discuss adaptation anymore, even if, of course, every week there are problems. Today, still floods, municipality buying the houses that are on the coastal zone, because that's now what is happening. So, and then, of course, a big issue about aligning, which was, of course, I was very proud of this article, and to the famous global article on Article 2, that we have to align all the financial flows to the climate objectives. Of course, still not there, of course, but we need 6.5 trillion a year. We are only 1.5 and not evenly distributed. But at the same time, you see moves. The investment in clean energy has, of course, grown enormously, mostly in China, $1.7 trillion. And in a way, we now have more money invested in renewable energy than in fossil fuel. But still, the stock of the investment in fossil fuel is still, of course, enormous. So the green technology, as I said, have matured. The renewable and battery are getting cheaper every year. The perception of the cost and benefits, in my view, has shifted significantly. Not totally. Again, I am an economist by training, and I teach international economics. I think that still, mostly the profession is still very reluctant to really put numbers on climate damage. So for that reason, they are always very optimistic about we should delay action. But still, we see now that it is a cost. I think India has seen really the net cost in GDP terms, points, because of what has happened since 22 and 2023 and 2024 in India. That's the same for mostly every country, even if it's not well documented most of the time. So now the way is, of course, to try to see what are the positive elements. China, of course, almost 900 billion in renewable energy in 2023. Inflation Reduction Act now, of course, but it was at least a model of, we think, jobs, we think industrial transformation, again, a positive force that EU has tried to adopt with a clean industrial deal that will be, at least the main element will be published at the end of this month. There is the idea that now, and it's a big progress in 2015, it's not only numbers and targets, but it's how we manage the transition in jobs, in region, in adaptation, the new economy to that reality. And finally, I think a positive force I hope we will see and listen to this year is the insurance and the reinsurance industry. You have, of course, listened to them. They say we cannot I think now in California, but it was the case before, or even in a number of states, you cannot find an insurance for your home against fires and sometimes against floods, depending where you are. So the almost 400 billion economic disaster in 2023 are not mostly covered by insurance. And so a global economy that is not insurable doesn't work. And that's true for many, many sectors that I hope that will make more understandable what is really at risk. But see, the last weeks and months, and it was not only Trump election, it was already a movement in US of litigation against companies that want to follow the objective of Paris, with align with a number of data to really decarbonize our portfolio. They are backtracking now. All the 2024 years was a story of backtracking from these commitments. Now even the companies doesn't want to say they do something on climate. They say they will continue, but they cannot talk about that. And then so we are now in a sort of incredible contradiction where climate damage are growing every day, every year. And then there is a sort of paralysis of action in front of this very powerful interest. So, and then on top of that, I think, and maybe that's a way out we can find to remobilize societies for climate action, demanding governments to be really serious, demanding companies not to hide and they have to deliver. It's a problem of climate justice. Climate justice in general between countries and climate justice in countries. Now, a number of academic works have shown that the 1% richer people in the world emit as much as 66% of the lower bias at the world level. So very few individuals, because of their excessive, on one side, consumption and investment in fossil fuel capital, are finally creating this very unequal balance between, of course, the way they want to live or they want the economy to be run, and the consequences for the poorest 50% of the and even in most developed countries, the emission of the poorest 50% of emitters are already in line with the 2030 decarbonization target. So there is a problem of economic justice that we have to tackle, and maybe the way to see if the policies and the were fairer, more just, that we can get the public opinion backing these policies that are supposed to be anti-people. So I think we should take injustice much more seriously in climate policies than we did in the past. Again, at international level, it was already a fact, a discussion, but I think internally it as well. And that's why, even if I must say, I may probably certainly optimistic, but I think we can find in this chaos we are facing, we need to find new ways of cooperative action. And so we may need a very different governance. We may need to have some actors that were not at the table part of it. We may need to put climate justice at the center of the discussion. We may need to really create new resources. And in particular, I am engaged in this, in that I think in the reform of the UNFCCC, all the discussion that has to happen, because we cannot stick to the agreement like it is. I'm saying all the time, I'm very sort of proud of what we did for Paris Agreement, but it's not a Bible. We have to make it adapt and evolve with the different power relation in the world, the different realities, the different evolution of the economic situation. So now I think we need to open up the governance of this type of collective action. I was never very in favor of club model because, you see G20, it's a club. They are not very effective in trying to deliver climate action. We need the victims to speak up. And that's why we need different format. But at the same time, we cannot make it out of a multilateral system, whatever it is, how different it has to be designed, how we do that with at least almost 4 years. Anyway, even more, of the US that decided that they would not never more play the role of, steering the world in a particular direction. So hegemony is in a way dead. That's not their story. They're more isolationist. I don't think China has already a view of how the world should be governed. And so it makes us to think not from scratch, because that doesn't exist in reality, but with a very, very different view of how the system should look like. I hope I'm not going to be too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence, for that incredibly lucid account of the different forces at stake. We're now going to hear from 3 respondents who I'll introduce now, and then they'll come up without further introduction, and then there'll be a discussion. So the first will be Christina Davis, who is the Edwin O. Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics at Harvard, and is the college's first ever centenary PPE visiting professor. Then Victoria Harwell, who's a Rhodes Scholar studying global and imperial history and looking particularly at leadership in different forms of local communities. And then Oliver Ray, a second-year biology student who's the JCR rep on the Carbon Control Committee at the college and compiled our first ever sustainability handbook. Christina, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a respondent. It's a great honor to be here. I really enjoyed your remarks, and I am hopeful that many will listen to your voice and continue the path forward for a new and better Paris Agreement. But it is a difficult time, and so I would like to reflect on 2 of the themes in your remarks. You spoke about needing a driver of a high ambition coalition. And I would like us to think about how can we have this coalition form. And I think as you spoke about the Paris Agreement, it was so remarkable because of its ability to unleash local level forces and the voices of the victims. And this was really important. I'm a scholar of international relations, and we tend to think that all change in the world comes in the hands of states, and typically the most powerful states. And so it's very important to think in the face of the United States as a hegemon stepping away from climate change, who will provide leadership? And the Paris Agreement did open more forces so that there was the compact of mayors, as you say, a safety net from these local voices, cities in the United States, forces around Europe, trying to fill the gap. But at the same time, the Paris Agreement did call for national commitments and governments making national commitments. And there's worry about backsliding in those commitments as the US leaves Paris. So who can provide the global leadership? And will it be the middle powers, South Africa or the United Kingdom, Japan, where I study? And how can we as scholars spur them to leadership? At the same time, is China going to be able to step up into this gap, taking the opportunity? You mentioned it has a mixed record, but how can you show this is its chance to show global leadership by making its own concessions? That leadership is not just rhetoric, but moving first. And that might mean directing its own aid or making ambitious cuts in its own reliance on coal and taking that step. And so I wonder, what can we do as scholars to push to create a high ambition coalition? That's my first set of reactions and questions. Second, when you think about in the practice of what can be done, your remarks talked about the force of economics having become positive, which is a huge change in the last decade, from thinking there's a trade-off of economic growth or climate change. And now you're saying the green technology competition could be a positive driver. And I agree with you completely. As someone studying trade, though, I have worried that Europe is going forward on a carbon market approach, while the US under the Biden administration was going forward on an industrial policy subsidy approach. Can we reconcile those? And where should the Paris Agreement adapt to this green technology arms race? The call for climate finance is that rich countries take money to give to help developing countries. But what do we do about the money that rich countries are spending to help their own industry? Is that a net positive? Or should it be restrained? Because right now we have an arms race and a tariff war, and green technology is right in the center of that. And neither the WTO nor the Paris Agreement seem set to restrain this. And I wonder if you have suggestions about how to direct global governance for helping the market economy become a positive force for climate change mobilization. I'll stop here and pass on to the...
First of all, thank you all for coming. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for your contributions in this space. I think they've done wonders in all of our lives. And I think also one of the things that I was thinking through with your presentation was this idea of the West reshaping its relationships to the global South. And I think one of the things that I focus on is colonization as a historical determinant of climate change. And I think one of the things that we have to question is also, why is there such bad relationships between the global South and the EU, the US, these big blocks of economic power that hold a lot of the determinants to this outcome if we are actually going to dig ourselves out of this hole. And then also, I thought it was interesting, like the community that we can kind of zoom in on in this conversation is actually farmers. And so you wrote recently in an article in the Politico, a fair future for farmers is a greener future for Europe, where you said, what Europe needs is instead a fair deal that addresses systemic issues underpinning our food system in order to restore dignity to farming. And I completely agree with this statement. I personally work with farmers in Ghana, which is the second largest producer of cocoa in the world. And they are at the center of a billion-dollar industry, which currently this year makes up $23.1 billion. Yet the majority of cocoa farmers daily are making about 40 cents USD on that cultivation. And so I was just wondering if, even though that's a microcosm in the world, I would love to hear your opinions on addressing systemic issues and inequalities of farmers in the global South on top of farmers in the West as well. So I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your hugely inspiring insight into the current climate situation. I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more on the role of the individual, just in terms of the individual as a consumer and also as a global citizen. I'm sure you're already aware, but emissions in the UK are about 4.4 tonnes per person per year, whereas in many Central African countries, they're less than 0.1 of a tonne per person. As individuals in rich countries, we clearly need to do more to reduce our personal footprints. Do you think individuals will willingly make these vital changes, or do they need to be enforced? As college environment rep, I've been doing quite a lot of work on promoting sustainable choices within the college, most recently in creating the Student Sustainability Handbook. In it, I talk about choices such as eating more vegan meals or travelling less. Will governments have to start enforcing these choices, for example, by taxing frequent flyers? Is this necessary, and at what point would you think these impinge on personal freedoms? And for the second part of my question, I wanted to ask you what you think the individual's role in halting climate change is. With governments currently not acting fast enough to prevent the climate warming above 2 degrees, do individuals, as well as you mentioned sort of city-states, need to step up into that leadership position? And how far do you think individuals need to go with that? I've been following the case of Roger Hallam, a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, who's currently appealing his 5-year prison sentence, the longest of any peaceful protester has ever been given in the UK. His lawyer claimed he acted out of sacrifice. Do we all need to make an equivalent sacrifice in the face of apathetic government? So that's the...
Well, thank you. Of course, as we are, I think nobody has of course, clear view where we go, what is a model. So that, in a way, a very fascinating moment, a little bit terrifying, but at the same time, we need a lot of creativity. And so all the elements you raise, I think, can open that discussion, and we have to take it from many angles and many levels. And this multi-level thinking is, I think, the necessity, which is really interesting because we were, as you mentioned, the traditional, well, of course, there are different schools in international relations, but the realist schools think that, of course, is always about power. And then you see in what can happen in the world that is not always the case. Sometimes ideas, forces can change. And that's why, again, when I was just as a testimony, witnessing how a state or university in the US can say, I am Pittsburgh Mayor, I am part of the Paris Agreement. It was a revolution in terms of governance. Huh? So we don't know. Finally, it's an open field where finally, like of course most theory would say cooperation is impossible, when in reality it's not. And that the condition of cooperation, I think we should be actively thinking about. I think, I think, of course, the whole challenge, which is in a way interesting, as US has this, in a way, withdrawing from the role of hegemon, and China still, we see that view of, which is not an hegemon proposing a model, well, not for the moment the case. So there is a space for many other society to be involved in the redefinition of what could be a 1948 moment. And this 1948 moment cannot be done without the citizens themselves. That I think, because you have to go so much in depth into what the politics, the action, the interaction on all the sectors, the economy, and the way we work together, and at the same time the fact that in 1948 there was much less countries and much less interaction between all of us. And now it's no more the case. So I think there is a space for inventing a new international relations theory that takes this multi-level, which I think a number of scholars have been working on that. But I think now we could do potentially the politics. That's why when we were talking about the Ghanaian farmers, which success for this new product was the old product that is now a new product in the diet, and see how there are ways to rebalance the injustice of this trade relation. There are ways, we know. Information on the prices, organization of the producers, informing the consumers they cannot accept to pay, that's something that will never get to the farmers themselves. We know how to do it. So we have now the concept and the methodology to redress these inequalities. So that's one thing that is strong, and at the same time, again, I don't see that because of different reasons, and because the power politics play so hard now. So we could be, in a way, saying, well, we cannot do anything because the power and armies and the military power is dominating the discussion. At the same time, when you look at our relation, the trade relation, make us so dependent from one to another. And so we can draw, and that's, of course, now you cannot talk about climate without trade policies. That's over. We don't know how to do that. People are just say what do we do, how we ensure a level playing field. All these questions are new, and but we could develop this idea of we are codependent. The farmers of Ghana are codependent from what the consumers are in Europe, but Europe is totally codependent on what is happening there. And just to stop, because the discussion has to be open, I can say, I met a lady from Ghana who is leading the accounting system and in a way checking what the companies are doing in Ghana. And my reward, it was last year in New York. And she said that she was checking the company's portfolio and how they decarbonize that portfolio in Ghana. And then I told myself, okay, maybe Paris Agreement will be put in the bin by this power or this other one. But the society has taken over. I was puzzled by this lady, very impressive. And this is happening everywhere. We talk about local authorities, but they are in companies or people just saying, look, are you doing the job? So this learning process, and finally, maybe the Paris Agreement, whatever we can do, it's a gigantic learning process for the societies. And that's the way that your generation that have been, stepping in the street and asking for more strong policy, or even go to the Constitutional Court in Germany or in France, you have learned that there is something that the government cannot not do, and you are there to put pressure on that. So can we think a cooperation action at global level that integrates this different dimension? I think yes, we can. At least we should try. That's my lessons learning, listening to all of you.
Thank you very much. I'm taking away both the sense of the turbulence of the times and also, in maybe a more optimistic mode, a kind of moments of creativity or opportunity to reshape how decisions are taken and how action happens. But that is all we have time for the formal proceedings of this evening. I would like to say a special thank you to those who joined online, who've been, as it were, invisible during the proceedings, but much appreciated, including a number of old members. And we look forward to welcoming you back to Queen's when you are able to get here. For those who are here, there are some drinks at the back of the auditorium, and we can continue these incredibly diverse lines of inquiry over discussions there. But could you please join me in thanking Laurence and the respondents?